1. Reflections on cultures that are in conflict today. We are living in a period of great dangers and of great opportunities, both for man and for the world, a period that also imposes a great responsibility on us all. During the past century, the possibilities available to man for dominion over matter have grown in a manner we may truly call unimaginable. But the fact that he has power over the world has also meant that man's destructive power has reached dimensions that can sometimes make us shudder. Here one thinks spontaneously of the threat of terrorism, this new war without national borders and without lines of battle. The fear that terrorists may get hold of nuclear and biological weapons is not unfounded, and this has induced even states under the rule of law to have recourse to internal systems of security similar to those that once existed only in dictatorships. And yet the feeling remains that all these precautions will never really be enough, since a completely global control is neither possible nor desirable. Less visible, but not for that reason less disturbing, are the possibilities of self-manipulation that man has acquired. He has investigated the farthest recesses of his being. He has deciphered the components of the human being, and now he is able, so to speak, to construct man on his own. This means that man enters the world no longer as a gift of the Creator, but as the product of our activity, and a product that can be selected according to requirements that we ourselves stipulate. In this way, the splendor of the fact that he is the image of God, the source of his dignity and of his inviolability, no longer shines upon this man. His only splendor is the power of human capabilities. Man is nothing more now than the image of man. But of what man? To this we must add the great problems of our planet, the inequality in the distribution of the goods of the earth, increasing poverty, the depletion and exploitation of the earth and of its resources, famine, the illnesses that threaten all the world, the clash of cultures. All this demonstrates that the growth of our possibilities is not matched by an equal development of our moral energy. Moral strength has not grown in tandem with the development of science. On the contrary, it has diminished, because the technological mentality confines morality to the subjective sphere. Our need, however, is for a public morality, a morality capable of responding to the threats that impose such a burden on the existence of us all. The true and gravest danger of the present moment is precisely this imbalance between technological possibilities and moral energy. The security we all need as a presupposition of our freedom and dignity cannot ultimately be derived from technical systems of control. It can come only from the moral strength of man, and where this is lacking or insufficient, the power man has will be transformed more and more into a power of destruction. It is indeed true that a new moralism exists today. Its key words are justice, peace, and the conservation of creation, and these are words that recall essential moral values, of which we genuinely stand in need. But this moralism remains vague and almost inevitably remains confined to the sphere of party politics, where it is primarily a claim addressed to others rather than a personal duty in our own daily life. For what does justice mean? Who defines it? What promotes peace? In the last decades, we have seen plenty of evidence on the streets and squares of our cities of how pacifism can be perverted into a destructive anarchism, or indeed into terrorism. The political moralism of the 1970s, the roots of which are far from dead, was a moralism that succeeded in fascinating even young people who were full of ideals. But it was a moralism that took the wrong direction, since it lacked the serenity born of rationality. In the last analysis, it attached a higher value to the political utopia than to the dignity of the individual, and it showed itself capable of despising man in the name of great objectives. The political moralism we have experienced, and still witness today, is far from opening the path to a real regeneration. Instead, it blocks the way. Consequently, the same is true of a Christianity and a theology that reduce the core of the message of Jesus, that is, the kingdom of God, to the values of the kingdom, identifying these values with the great slogans of political moralism, while at the same time proclaiming that these slogans are the synthesis of the religions. In this way, they forget God, although it is precisely He who is both the subject and the cause of the kingdom. All that remains in the place of God are the big words and values that are open to any kind of abuse. This brief look at the situation of the world leads us to reflect on the situation of Christianity today, and hence on the foundations on which Europe rests. We can say that while Europe once was the Christian continent, it was also the birthplace of that new scientific rationality which has given us both enormous possibilities and enormous menaces. Naturally, Christianity did not begin in Europe, and this means that it cannot be classified as a European religion or as the religion of the European cultural sphere. But it was precisely in Europe that Christianity took on its most efficacious cultural and intellectual form, and this is why it remains intimately linked in a very special way to Europe. On the other hand, it is also true that this Europe, from the Renaissance onward, and in a fully fledged manner since the age of the Enlightenment, has developed precisely that scientific rationality which led to the geographical unity of the world and to the encounter between the continents and cultures in the age of the great discoveries. This same rationality leaves its imprint on all the world today in a much deeper way, thanks to the technological culture that science has made possible. Indeed, in a certain sense, scientific rationality is imposing uniformity on the world. In the wake of this form of rationality, Europe has developed a culture that, in a manner hitherto unknown to mankind, excludes God from public awareness. His existence may be denied altogether, or considered unprovable and uncertain, and hence as something belonging to the sphere of subjective choices. In either case, God is irrelevant to public life. This is a purely functional rationality that has shaken the moral consciousness in a way completely unknown to the cultures that existed previously, since it maintains that only that which can be demonstrated experimentally is rational. Since morality belongs to a different sphere altogether, it disappears as a specific category. But since we do after all need some kind of morality, it has to be discovered anew in some other way. In a world based on calculations, it is calculation of consequences that determines what should be considered moral and immoral. In this way, the category of the good vanishes, as Kant clearly showed. Nothing is good or evil in itself. Everything depends upon the consequences that may be thought to ensue upon an action. If, then, it is true to say that Christianity has found its most efficacious form in Europe, it is also true to say that a culture has developed in Europe that is the most radical contradiction, not only of Christianity, but of all the religious and moral traditions of humanity. This shows us that Europe is going through a genuine traction, to use a medical term, and we can understand how deep-rooted are the tensions that our continent must face up to. Above all, it is here that we also see the responsibility we Europeans must shoulder in this moment of history. In the debate about the definition of Europe and its new political shape, we are not fighting some nostalgic battle in the rear guard of history. Rather, we are taking seriously our tremendous responsibility for humanity today. Let us look more closely at this antagonism between the two cultures that have both left their mark on Europe. In the debate about the preamble to the European Constitution, this antagonism has come to light in two controversies: the question of the reference to God in the Constitution, and the question of mentioning the Christian roots of Europe. We are told that we need not be alarmed, since Article 52 of the Constitution guarantees the institutional rights of the churches. But this in fact means that, in the life of Europe, the churches are assigned their place on the level of day-to-day political compromises. But the message they proclaim is not allowed to make any impact on the level of the foundations on which Europe rests. Only superficial reasons are given in the public debate for this clear refusal, and it is clear that such justifications conceal the true motivation instead of disclosing it. The claim that a mention of the Christian roots of Europe would wound the feelings of the many non-Christians who live in this continent is not particularly convincing, since this basically involves a historical fact that no one can seriously deny. Naturally, this historical observation also contains a reference to the present, since the mention of the roots indicates the remaining sources of moral orientation, which is one factor in the identity of the formation known as Europe. Who would be offended by this? Whose identity is threatened thereby? The Muslims, who so often tend to be mentioned in this context, feel threatened not by the foundations of our Christian morality, but by the cynicism of a secularized culture that denies its own foundations. Nor are our Jewish fellow citizens offended by the reference to the Christian roots of Europe, since these roots go back to Mount Sinai and bear the imprint of the voice that rang out on the mountain of God. We are united with the Jews in those great basic orientations given to man by the Ten Commandments. The same applies to the reference to God. It is not the mention of God that offends those who belong to other religions. Rather, it is the attempt to construct the human community in a manner that absolutely excludes God. The motivations of this double refusal are deeper than one might suspect from the reasons we actually hear. They presuppose the idea that only the radical culture born of the Enlightenment, which has attained its full development in our own age, can be constitutive of European identity. Alongside this culture, various religious cultures with their respective rights can coexist, on condition, and to the degree, that they respect the criteria of the Enlightenment culture and subordinate themselves to it. This Enlightenment culture is substantially defined by the rights to liberty. Its starting point is that liberty is a fundamental value and the criterion of everything else. The freedom of choice in matters of religion, which includes the religious neutrality of the state, the liberty to express one's own opinion on condition that it does not call precisely this canon into question, the democratic ordering of the state, that is, the parliamentary control of the organs of the state, the freedom to form political parties, the independence of those who administer the law, and finally, the protection of the rights of man and the prohibition of discrimination. On this point, the canon is still in the process of formation, since there exist contrasting human rights, as we see in the conflict between a woman's right to freedom and the unborn child's right to life. The concept of discrimination is constantly enlarged, and this means that the prohibition of discrimination can be transformed more and more into a limitation on the freedom of opinion and on religious liberty. Very soon it will no longer be possible to affirm that homosexuality, as the Catholic Church teaches, constitutes an objective disordering in the structure of human existence, and the fact that the Church is convinced that she does not have the right to confer priestly ordination on women is already seen by some as irreconcilable with the spirit of the European Constitution. I mention only some points here. I do not intend to provide an exhaustive list of the contents of this canon of the Enlightenment culture. It is obvious that it contains important values that are essential for us, precisely as Christians, and we do not wish to do without them. At the same time, it is equally obvious that the concept of liberty on which this culture is based inevitably leads to contradictions, since it is either badly defined or not defined at all. And it is clear that the very fact of employing this concept entails limitations on freedom that we could not even have imagined a generation ago. A confused ideology of liberty leads to a dogmatism that is proving ever more hostile to real liberty. We must, of course, return to the question of the inherent contradictions in the form that the Enlightenment culture takes today, but first we must finish our description of it. Since it is the culture of a reason that has finally achieved complete self-awareness, it naturally boasts of its claimed universality and imagines that it is complete in itself without needing any other cultural factors to complement it. We see these two characteristics clearly in the discussion of which states may join the European community, and especially in the debate about the potential entry of Turkey to this community. Here we have a state, or perhaps better, a cultural environment, that does not have Christian roots, but has been influenced by Islamic culture. Ataturk attempted to transform Turkey into a laicist state, seeking to plant on Muslim soil the secular attitudes that had matured in the Christian world of Europe. And one may of course ask whether this is in fact possible. But according to the thesis of the laicist Enlightenment culture of Europe, it is only the norms and substance of this same Enlightenment culture that can determine the identity of Europe, and it follows that every state that accepts these criteria can belong to Europe. Ultimately, it is unimportant to know on which framework of roots this culture of liberty and democracy is planted. And we are told that this is precisely why the roots cannot be included in the definition of the bases of Europe, for these are dead roots that do not form part of today's identity. Accordingly, this new identity, which is defined exclusively by the Enlightenment culture, entails that God has nothing whatever to do with public life and with the foundations of the state. This makes everything logical and even, in a certain sense, plausible. For what higher good could we wish than that democracy and human rights be respected everywhere? But at this point, we must ask whether this Enlightenment laicist culture is truly the culture, finally revealed in all its universality, of a reason that is common to all men, a culture that must be accepted everywhere, even if it is rooted in a soil that is historically and culturally diverse. And one must ask whether this culture is truly complete in itself, so that it does not need any roots outside itself.